Hello, I'm Susan Kamei, and I'm excited to tell you about my book, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. Let me take you back to Monday, December 8, 1941, the day after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. My 14-year-old father sat in an assembly at Huntington Union High School in Orange County, California. His school had gathered to listen to the radio broadcast of President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressing the United States Congress. As a high school freshman, even before the declaration of war became official, my father knew that his life and the life of other persons of Japanese ancestry in the United States would never be the same. With the eyes of his teachers and classmates upon him as he sat in that assembly, my father realized that he would be the target of animosity and decided he would not be returning to school. He and other Japanese Americans would be stunned by the intensity of the public hysteria that would build over the next few months. Hysteria that would characterize him, a teenager from a farming family, as the enemy solely on the basis of his race. Just 10 weeks later, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This executive order set in motion the wholesale removal of about 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and put them in detention in government-constructed camps in the interior of our country for the duration of the war. 2/3 of those incarcerated were, like my father and mother, born in this country and therefore American citizens by birth. Their immigrant parents were precluded by law from becoming naturalized citizens, even if they considered the United States to be their adopted country and had no intention of ever returning to Japan. But no matter what rights they had as citizens or as lives they led of committed loyalty to America, our government justified wresting them from their homes, their livelihoods, and their educations as a military necessity, holding them without charges under armed guard for years, long after it became apparent that the U.S. would prevail in the war. What we now know is that this military necessity justification is a falsehood. It was more a cover for the real causes of this tragic episode in our country's past. Decades of discriminatory policies and practices, anti-immigration sentiments, labor and agribusiness fear of economic competition, global geopolitics, a failure of political leadership, and ultimately a breakdown in our constitutional system. And yet, to the extent that our US history textbooks make even scant mention that this ever took place, the military necessity fiction persists. Why should we care today about events that happened 80 years ago? I think we should care because this is what's happening today. I wish the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans could be relegated to a footnote in World War II history. But sadly, it's more relevant today than ever, as our society grapples with issues of systemic racism and government policies that result in unjustified detentions, family separation, and the presumption of guilt instead of innocence until proven guilty. We should care not only to know that this happened, but also why it happened. There are those who now refer to the Japanese American incarceration as precedents for rounding up classes of individuals based on race, national origin, religion, or some other category out of expressed concerns for national security, the contemporary equivalent of military necessity. We should care when politics subvert our constitutional checks and balances, as they did in 1942, and be aware of how unconstitutional practices of the past can be repeated today. So this is what I teach in my undergraduate course at the University of Southern California. To approach the totality of these considerations, we examine the social and political context before the war, as well as the consequences of the incarceration after the war, including the generational impact upon descendants of the incarcerees. As I compiled the materials for this course with this scope in mind, I realized that there was no one resource that pulled together all these aspects of the incarceration experience. So this book is a compendium of those resources that I gathered and includes more than 900 references to primary and leading secondary sources. And my goal is to make these resources easily accessible to teachers, researchers, and students from middle school and up. You might think of it also as a guided tour through the fine digital collections of entities such as the National Archives, the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, Densho, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Go for Broke National Education Center, as well as the work of numerous leading scholars. More importantly, though, my hope is to make this history come alive for readers of all backgrounds. So there are more than 300 first-person accounts that propel the historical narrative. Most of these are voices of the second-generation Americans from their oral histories, print and digital interviews, and their congressional testimonies. Some voices are those who have memories of the camp experience as young children, such as actor George Takei, or my parents' contemporaries who spent their entire high school years imprisoned, or young adults who served with incredible bravery in the military, such as decorated veteran Senator Daniel K. Inouye from Hawaii. I've also included biographies of the Japanese American voices who were included, and these were compiled so that you can learn what their lives were like, as well as what they did with their lives. There are just some amazing stories of resilience, accomplishment, and grace in the face of adversity. I'm particularly pleased that you can read about some incredible Nisei women and their contributions to their families, the arts, professions, and the community. And just to name a few, Minnie Okubo, Mary Tsukamoto, and Yoshio Tokisaki. Whether you're a member of a book club or an interested person in social issues, or perhaps even a family history detective, you'll be able to develop a personal connection with the experiences of the incarcerees. Because, after all, the way to overcome prejudice and fear and suspicion of those who are not like us and to build understanding is simply to get to know one another. I've come away with profound admiration and appreciation for the first generation Issei and the second generation Nisei. I was privileged to get to know so many of the Nisei community leaders when I was a young volunteer in what we now call the Redress Campaign, the legislative grassroots effort that resulted in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. One of the proudest moments of my life was to be an invited guest to the White House to witness President Ronald Reagan signing this act into law, which recognized the wrongfulness of our government's wartime actions and provided token reparatory payments to the then surviving incarcerees. I'm especially delighted that Norman Mineta, one of the congressional leaders for the redress bill, has provided the foreword for this book. After serving as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 21 years, he went on to serve as U.S. Secretary of Commerce for President Bill Clinton, the first Asian American to serve in a presidential cabinet, and then as U.S. Secretary of Transportation for President George W. Bush, making him one of the few individuals in our country's history who has served as a cabinet member for presidents of different political parties. Secretary Mineta and his family included me as part of their family when I was a law student in Washington, D.C. And over the years, he has continued to be an inspiration to me as an example of a great American. I'll close with these thoughts about what it means to be an American. The title of the book comes from a story that circulated among the incarcerees in the camps. It said that a small girl was startled to be in an environment surrounded by all Japanese faces, and she mistakenly assumed that her family had taken her to Japan. One day she looked up at her mother and said something along the lines of, "Mommy, I don't like it here. Let's go back home." When can we go back to America? To me, the story has symbolic meaning. When the events of World War II unfolded, my parents and their fellow Nisei could not believe that this unconscionable experience was happening to them as citizens of the United States, in the land of their birth. In the years since their wartime hardships, these citizens often wondered if the day would ever come when their rights and those of others similarly targeted would be treated with equal protection under the law. They asked themselves during and after the war, when will the America promised in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution come home again? When will its fundamental ideal of due process apply to us? What is chiseled on the stone walls of the National Archives is the sentence, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." I earnestly hope that as you read this book, you'll come to appreciate the degree of vigilance we each must have so that the liberties and justice guaranteed under the Constitution truly will apply to all. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy the book.